So I worked at Goldman Sachs for around 1.5 years, and I've also cracked a remote job offer for around 4 CR. If you haven't checked out that video, you can click right here. And so I feel I've seen both sides of the coin. And having this experience firsthand, I wanted to make a video around what it's like working for an on-site job in India in a big tech company or in finance, compared to working in a company remotely right from the comfort of your home. With that, let's get right into the video. The first point is the ease of getting into a company. In my experience, it's much easier to get a job in a big tech company. And the reason is because a lot of these companies are doing quantity hiring. These companies have a lot of money, and hence they hire a pool of talent initially, give them some basic packages, and eventually the people who do well end up climbing the career ladder, and the people who don't usually stay at the company at the same level, or they move to a different company. These offices in India are usually back offices for these companies, and hence they're not paying as much as they would pay a US employee, so it's easier for them to do quantity hiring and then eventually filter out the good talent. If you want an offer from one of these good companies, the best thing to do is data structures algorithms, and you can easily get into one of the FAANG companies in India. Comparing this to a remote job, it's very hard to find a remote job in India because there's no standard practice on how to get hired. It's also very difficult for companies or people in the US to find people in India, and hence most probably you have to be really good at some niche technology, or you have to be really good at open source to showcase your work to the world and differentiate yourself from everyone. You also have to be the one who's looking for opportunities actively. These companies are usually startups that are not very actively hiring, especially from India. So if you want an offer here, you'll have to be extremely proactive in reaching out to these companies and also have to be very good at what you do. Rarely will you need data structures and algorithms when you're interviewing for such a company, but you will need expertise in some technology that gets you in the door. In my case, when I started interviewing for remote jobs, I realized WebRTC is a technology that's growing very quickly, and a lot of companies in the US need expertise on this, and there are not a lot of people who are teaching this protocol or doing this in the first place. And hence I ended up understanding the protocol and helping a bunch of companies out in their WebRTC problems, even if they paid me below industry standard. And eventually when I became an expert in this field, all I had to do was put my experience in my resume and I would get actively reached out. If I were to do this all over again, today I'd focus on two technologies. One is Web3 or blockchain, and the other one is AI or ML. I think these are two fields that are very niche. There's a lot of funding in these markets, but there are not a lot of experts who understand these very well and can build scalable systems at the level at which these companies expect. So if I was looking out for a remote opportunity today, I would become an expert in either AI or machine learning or in Web3 and start interviewing very actively for companies in these fields. The second big point here is money. FAANG, MANG or big tech companies with on-site offices in India usually lag behind remote opportunities. And the reason is because one, this is a back office, and two, they take purchasing power parity into consideration a lot. They do this for the US as well. So if you're working out of California versus out of Texas, your salary bands would be different. So it's not different for them to pay employees in India lesser than their counterparts in the US. Although as talent finds more and more opportunities working remotely and getting paid higher, I've seen these companies have also raised their bands. And so I've seen a lot of my friends make 1 CR or more in these companies. What you can make in a remote offer from India is slightly less than what you would make if you were working on site for that company, but it'll usually be more than what you would make if you're working in India for an on-site company. The reason is because a lot of talent is crazy about getting into these big tech companies, and hence they have a pool of people to choose from, versus when a company is hiring you remotely, most probably you're really good at what you do and they really want you, and since there aren't a lot of people who are good at that field, they'll usually be open to paying top dollar for you. The other reason is that when a FAANG company is hiring you, they're most probably taking a bet on you. They're hiring you based on your data structures and algorithms, so there's a good chance that the bet that they took on you did not work out well and you end up becoming an underperforming employee. Hence they average out packages initially and eventually you grow in the company. But in a remote offer, when they're hiring you, they know you're really good at something. There would be no warm-up period for you to understand the systems. You'll hit the ground running as soon as you join the company, and hence they end up saving on that downtime of a few months that you'd probably spend when you're working in a big tech company. The third important point, and this is very specific to India, is INR depreciation. So as you might have seen in my previous videos, usually the Indian rupee depreciates over dollar. So when I was working at Goldman, I was making 30 lakh rupees a year. Back then that was around $45,000. Next year I got an increment. My salary went up to 32 lakh rupees, but I was still making $45,000 because the rupee depreciated over dollar. This is a very big benefit for companies who are either selling their product in the US or have raised money in US dollars. Most of their money is present in US dollars in some bank account in the US. And if they have an office in India, they can show their employees that they're giving them salary increments, even though they're paying them the same dollar amount every month. This is also true for startups in India. There are a lot of Indian startups that are actually based out of the US and have raised money in US dollars, and the money is sitting in a bank account in the US. And hence, when you're getting that salary hike, you should probably look at what your salary hike actually is in US dollar terms, because US dollar is what is the global reserve currency at the moment. It's very easy to be fooled to be getting a salary increment when your salary hasn't actually increased in US dollar terms, which is what the company is making money in. This took me a while to realize, and this gets more and more prominent as you start making more money. So I would keep this at the back of my head when I'm joining a company either in India or in the US. If you're working in a small startup in India, and if your startup is based out of of the US, they've raised funds in the US, you should be able to ask for your salary to be pegged to the US dollar. And I'm not saying this will always be the case. Maybe India becomes a superpower and INR becomes the global reserve currency, but that's not the case at the moment. So if given a choice, I'd probably choose a company that's paying me in US dollars, and that's almost every remote company. A remote company doesn't even know what INR disposals are, they're just sending you money in US dollars. And when you're asking for an increment, it's very obvious for them to give you an increment in US dollars. With that, let's move to the fourth point. This is probably the most important point, and it's about personal growth. When you join a company in tech, initially, the bands are very varied. There might be a very dumb guy who gets a 40 lakh package. There might be a very smart guy who ends up getting a 20 lakh package. But this averages out very quickly in 4 or 5 years. The person who has better skills will eventually make much more money than another person who got a good offer, maybe based on their college. And I personally feel your learning curve is much higher in a startup. The reason being, you're not being spoon-fed. You actually don't have any seniors who can help you out in the office. You're pretty much on your own, given a task, and then you have to figure out everything about that task. If there are bugs or issues, you're probably the one who's solving them. And hence you understand the whole system end to end. There's usually not a lot of dependency on other teams, which is very common in big tech. You own the product end to end, and that usually leads to a higher learning curve. Personally, in my experience, I've seen things move very slowly when you're in a big company. You're basically a very small part of a very big machine, and hence it's very easy to become complacent, chill throughout the day and not work as much. I'm not saying everyone does this, but I'm saying there is a path for you to do it. Versus in a remote job, there's no real path for you to be complacent. As soon as you start becoming lazy, you'll probably get fired, and hence there is no real incentive for buttering up your manager or pretending to show you've achieved something that you haven't. And this is very common in big tech. I know this because I've done this. It's very easy to please your manager by not working as hard and projecting that you or your team have created more impact than they actually have. Big tech is very big. It's very hard to know what a specific person is working on, and it's very hard to judge whether or not they're meeting expectations. That gives you a path of becoming slightly lazy, and that has detrimental effects on your career in the long term. Personally, seeing this firsthand, I know that the learning curve that you can get in a remote company or a remote startup is usually much higher than a big tech company, and I trade that any day over stability, money, or any perks that a big tech company gives. In the end, after you've worked in a company for a few years, you don't want your final achievement to be, I worked on an XYZ product in this company. Your final goal should be to grow as much as you can so that you can either get better opportunities or work on something of your own based on the skills that you've gained. And remote companies are a much better way to achieve that. The next point is stability. I think your job stability depends much more on your skills versus on which type of company you're working for. Of course, you have a better buffer in a big tech company if you're not performing well, because these companies have a lot of money and they don't really lay off very quickly. But if you're not growing and you don't have the right set of skills, you'll get laid off irrespective of which company you're working for. Thinking a little bit deeper on this, since the learning curve is much higher in a remote job, you'll most probably grow very quickly, and hence you'll be much more stable in your career compared to a big tech company. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes big tech companies do have really good teams, but it's very hard for you to land into that team that's helping you grow in your career along with the work that you're doing for the company. Lastly, a very important point that a lot of you have asked is working hours. And yes, it is true, you might have to change your working hours a little bit. It's usually not expected, and no one will explicitly tell you to work US hours. But when you're working for a US based company, if there is an issue that pops up in the middle of the night that was caused by you, and they have to wait another 8 hours for you to wake up to fix that issue, that becomes slightly problematic. So it's usually expected that you have some sort of an overlap. There are also stand-ups that happen in these companies that are usually in the US time zone, and hence, yes, this will affect your sleeping schedule a little bit. It'll also affect your work-life balance. It depends on you whether or not you're okay with that trade-off. Personally, for me, I am a night owl. I like working late ever since college, and hence it worked out pretty well for me. But if this isn't you, if you like working from 9 to 5, then this might not be the best career option for you, unless you find a team that's extremely asynchronous and does not care about working hours at all. Now that we've reached the end of this video, it's time for you to introspect what works well for you. Everyone is different, everyone's skill set is different, and everyone's goal is different. The good thing is both of these are very lucrative offers. If you're thinking of getting into tech, you'll most probably do okay, and which one of these paths you choose really depends on what works well for you. If you're looking for a remote offer more specifically, there's a newsletter linked in the description where I'll be sending out remote offers as they come by. So feel free to subscribe to it, and I'll see you in the next one.